Hey YouTube, welcome back to the RPG Daily. I'm your host Richard Quiner, and you are here once again for the Game Master's Craft. This has been quite an adventure of pulling this show together, and again, we have a great guest today. This is Malcolm Trotter from the Gentleman Game Master on Instagram. He deals a lot with, what would I call it, public games, introducing people into the game, and running some great theater of the mind. So, with that, we are going to jump into this. Malcolm, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us
Thank you,
today.
Rich.
Before we dive in, because we had a little pre-conversation, and I kind of regret
Yeah.
not recording that because there was some great stuff being said. But now that you're here, what is it you do, and what can people expect to find from your social media presence?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a dungeon master. I consider myself I think there's like three types of dungeon masters, and the third one is a combination of the two. But there are the writers, like this, and the directors. So I call myself I'm like a director. I think like in that mindset, and sometimes I'll put credits on my games, and I'll put DM rector. And so the idea is. I'm trying to create an experience at the table. I think that's the most important thing, and in addition to the camaraderie and all the magic that happens at the table. And so I run public games. I have an Instagram account where I just kind of like all of us, where we share our art form on Instagram and Facebook. It's called the Gentleman _ Game Master. And then just recently, I started actually just offering because I was running so many games. I was running games at home. I was running games at work. I was running games for friends. And then between me and my wife, she was like, "You don't have any more time to run any more games." She was like, "Unless you're getting paid for them." And I was kind of like, hmm. And so no, then I had actually a few people approached me about that, saying, "Hey, we'd be willing to if you could put a game together, or would you have ever thought about doing that?" And so I made a public forum, a meetup group called the D&D Experience Point, and I've been doing that since October, and it's been kind of awesome, kind of blowing up and giving. It's just been really nice to have so many people that want this kind of experience, and it's been a big learning experience for me because I'm forced to learn and grow from playing with so many different type of players.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
having so many games that you are running, on one hand, I fully agree with your wife. There comes a point where something's gotta give, and you can't keep stacking on games. I tried that; it didn't work.
Yeah.
Now I'm down to two. I do two sessions a week, around there. But it also sounds to me like you have a relatively long history with the game. How did you get started in the hobby
Mhm.
of tabletop role playing?
Yeah, man, I've been a geek ever since I was a kid, and it started. It was interesting. My story is one of I grew up in the inner city. I grew up in Inglewood, California, and I grew up during the Satanic Panic, where
Mm-hmm.
D&D was kind of the devil stuff, and my parents didn't completely buy it, but they were always hearing it. There were Nightline and Dateline television shows about it, and
Mm-hmm.
there was all this, and so it was just kind of they just kind of shunned me, kind of pushed me away from it, and I always wanted to kind of try it. There weren't very many comic book shops, let alone hobby shops in my area. And It started with a buddy of mine, one like white friend. I went to Crozier Middle School, his race doesn't matter, but it was just he was like the one like white kid who knew about it,
Yeah.
and so he invited me to his house one day, and went to over there for dinner, and he pulled out Hero Quest. And I played Hero Quest, and I was blown away. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't get enough of this!" So I was asking my parents for it, and at that time they were like, "Okay, well, it's a Milton Bradley game. We'll let you play Hero Quest," but they couldn't find it.
Mm.
So they ended up getting me like Dark World, which was just not Hero Quest. But
Yeah.
then that led to I eventually got Dragon Strike. I was watching Jeremy yesterday. He played Dragon Strike was it, and became with the VHS tape. And then from there, that was my first taste of D&D, but I still couldn't get full on. That was a TSR game,
Mm-hmm.
but it was still like you can't go D&D.
Yeah.
And then from there, I went like Battle Masters. I went into Warhammer territory, played a lot of war gaming throughout my youth.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would have to drive 40 miles to Palisades or to the closest shop to get a game in with anybody.
Yeah.
And then college kind of started dabbling with like games like Palladium games like Robotech and stuff
Oh
like
yeah.
that. But could never find like a consistent group.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually thought that I had done the whole D&D thing. I was like, well, that's just the grandfather of games, and I never really played more first edition or second edition. I can honestly say I didn't. And I'll make this long story short. Went around to fourth, and finally picked up a fourth edition.
Okay.
I started to become an avid board. I became a big board game collector. I was
Mm-hmm.
playing all these board games all the time. So I finally was like, but I was always bringing stories into my board games. Like there had to be a reason for why everything was happening. Kind of like taking the narrative and really ramping it up. And then I played fourth edition. I was like, this is cool, but it feels a lot like a board game. And then I put that one away. Nothing bad with it, but I was like, okay, I've got games where a lot of the system works similar.
Mm-hmm.
But fifth edition was where like the light bulb went off, and I was like, oh my gosh, the world is not only mine, but it's the players. Like this is it. This is,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't, the rest is history. I've just been playing fifth edition,
Yeah.
from there.
That seems to be a very common thing from a lot of the people I've talked to. It's fifth edition is when the light switch flips. That's what happened with
It's
me.
weird.
I feel like Cameron from D&D Coalition, I think he said that too. Just a lot of people are like, yeah, didn't quite get it with 3.5 or 4th edition, but 5th edition was just like, oh, this all makes sense
Yeah.
now. I want to look back. This is more just nostalgia for me. You mentioned the Palladium books and Rifts. Um, I had a stack, like the entire, megaverse of the Rifts book when I was in high school. Never could find
Hmm.
anyone to play that game with me.
Never.
And I know it wasn't a perfect game, but it's fun hearing someone else mention it because I'm like, oh yeah, I missed that because that was a crazy
Yeah.
world of Rifts.
No, Rift was. I had read a little bit of Rift as well, and I was just, I don't know, man. Yeah, but you're right. I didn't play very many games. It was very
Hmm.
hard to find someone to play
Yeah.
them with, for sure.
Interesting thing going to the Satanic Panic because you said your parents
Hmm.
weren't quite buying into it, but you still had to be a little cautious with that.
Exactly.
Um, so, as you got older and got into the gaming yourself, have you ever revisited that topic with your folks?
I do. I actually revisited on my personal Instagram last week because I wear the Death Saves, the Joe Magnianello brand stuff,
Uh-huh.
sometimes. And even, I think about it. It plays a part in who I am sometimes. So when I first purchased my Beholder hat, I think up there, I like that one had a Beholder, but I just got my hat that actually says Death Saves. And so I was just posting some regular stuff around the house or out getting groceries. And my dad texted me. He's like, what's up with the Death Saves hat? He's like, what does that mean? So I like call him, and we have a really good relationship, me and my parents. I was like, oh,
Hmm.
let me break it down for you. So I was like, remember back in the day, and I tell him the story, and he's like, oh, I get it now. And I'm like, yeah, it's like it's just kind of a play on that and a riff on it, and everybody used that Jesus Saves font back in the day, which has nothing to do with any necessary religion, truly. And he was like, okay, I get it. And I was like, this Death Saves is a mechanic in the game. You actually need to
Hmm.
make these. And he's like, okay, cool. And my dad's like, okay, that's cool. Like, thanks for explaining it. But so we still have that riff. And I end up going, I realized with friends and family. So I went online. I was like, yeah, let me explain the hat for
Hmm.
everybody who might be questioning it. So sometimes you revisit it, but I think it's been overall positives. Everyone I know that has even thought that at one time,
Hmm.
who've ever sat at a table or seen what I do, realize that the game is truly can be a joy and can really really be a huge positive in people's lives.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how that kind of. I know I've seen recently some people, very few, kind of revisiting that idea, like, oh, D&D is evil, but those are the same people that look at video games and say, oh, these cause you to be super violent. But the
Yeah, you're looking
majority
for.
are turning around and looking at it as like, oh, this is a great storytelling. There's a lot of social skills you can learn from it. My mother was a similar situation where she was kind of like, oh, the media, it's pretty bad. But then Christmas 2 years ago, I got her to sit down and play. And so she was a barbarian dwarf. And the first time she says,
Yeah,
oh, I rage, I was like, I did it. I vindicated,
yeah,
being a nerd is great.
yeah,
And my 80-year-old
yeah.
mother understands now. Um, and that's
That's
a
awesome.
an amazing
Culture
time.
makes all that.
Hmm.
Yes, yes. It's really interesting, and I always tell people when they ask about D&D, even like they're not, even if they're not saying it's about the devil, or it just seems too weird. It seems too far fetched to go there. I just say, people have been, most of us have been resigned to thinking certain things are norms. So you think
Hmm.
it's normal to go to work, or work at this point, work at your house for 8 hours, and then turn on Netflix, and then watch other people pretend for the next 2 or 3. And just because they get paid for it, it's somehow okay. It's okay if Christian Bale's in a rubber suit playing Batman, but he's doing the same thing you're doing when you're playing D&D. And actually, instead of being a pacifist in your entertainment, you can be engaged in your entertainment. That's what video games offer us. But even further, D&D offers even more than the video game, because the video game, even still, even though it's offering me a chance to control the story, it is still a packaged, finished product. There are only so many ways that story changes.
Yeah.
And D&D has kind of brought us back to literally back to our caveman days, I call it, back to the truest form is when we sat around fires and told stories,
Mm-hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, and that's the magic behind it to me.
That is amazing. Would you say that's your favorite part of the hobby, or do you have something that you like even more?
Man, I love so many parts of this hobby. This going back to our conversation before we got on air, is that I love I love stories and novels and movies. And I love those moments when I'm watching a film, when it hits me. And so a lot of, DMs will say that they're looking to tell an amazing story. I'm usually just looking for the moments. I'm trying to find the moments, and I'm trying to create a good story so that I can facilitate the places where the players will have that moment, whether it be an
Mm.
aha moment, a joyous moment, a sad moment. One of my favorite things is to get my players cry. If people cry at the table, I have like achieved I have achieved a greater strength than having them laugh at the table. It's actually one of the things that I can't force it, but when it
Yeah.
happens, I'm like, yes, But I think it's all about like I look at the game kind of like I was telling you, like a movie, in that the dice and the miniatures, as much as I love them, and the toys and all the stuff, the books, they're just the behind the scenes. They help facilitate that story. So they're the gaffer, they're the cameraman, the dice are, all these different things that help the movie come together. And then what you're left with when you actually watch the movie is everybody's kind of left with the movie that's in their mind. That memory is the
Yeah.
most important thing. So yeah, that's kind of my favorite part of it,
That's very fun. And thinking about it cinematically, that's something I also do. I'm a film guy. That's why I'm in California. And you had
Yeah.
mentioned you have that kind of cinematic mindset. Do you have any tips for newer DMs who might be trying to get into getting in like the cinematic mindset for running their own games?
Yeah. Um, and this is it's also something that I think the biggest you'll hear people say this all the time, but the biggest I guess advice is to be descriptive and to describe things. But it gets difficult, especially a 2 or 3 hour game, to try to constantly redescribe combat, how to make the same action that the fighter has done 12 times fresh,
Mm-hmm.
can be difficult. And that's why it's almost like, I watched an interesting documentary about sommeliers when it comes to wine. And they said you
Mm-hmm.
would get, I know it's crazy, but you get better at tasting wine when you know what everything tastes like and you know what everything smells like. So you walk into the grocery store and you smell every orange and you smell the apples. And so with D&D, it's the same way. You experience life and you figure out, like, when you're walking on a sunny day, think about the sunny day. Think about, what is it, just sunny, or what does the sun actually feel like? What does it look like when it's setting in the sky? What kind of colors are there? What kind of smells are there? Where's the pollen at? And the more you do that outside of the game,
Mm-hmm.
the better you'll become at being descriptive in the game. And the second thing I'll say is, often pose questions to your players, like have them describe things. That wizard who's been casting Mage Hand or Magic Missile, every time they played with another DM, have them describe, what does your Magic Missile look like? How does it feel? How does it feel when you generate that type of power? I think asking the players, when you do swing or when you do something, what does your fighting style look like? Often they'll be like, I never thought, I just thought I was swinging an axe. But if they start to think about how can they relate it to somebody in a movie they've seen, does it feel more martial arts? Does it feel more graceful? Then suddenly everyone at the table starts to see the same, or closer to the same story.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So that would be my advice.
That's a really that's a new one. That's basically living your life and being in the moment. When you're out doing things, can help you learn and help you describe things more accurately. But you also said something, and this is where I'm concerned, and you're gonna help
Okay.
me get past this concern,
All
because
right.
I think every time I'm playing a game and I ask a player to describe something for me, or ask them a question to try to get a descriptive moment out of it, I get two responses. One,
Oh.
sometimes it becomes a very kind of blasé description. That's fine. But the other, I always feel like I'm slowing things down too much. How do
Mm.
you keep the players invested into the other players' into that moment? How do you bring them into that?
Yeah, that's a really good actual question, and I have run into that before. And I think earlier on I just went into it a lot. And it's either A, I've gotten really accustomed to certain types of players, and certain players know when I ask them, they know what I'm going for. When I play with newer players, I am more patient, and I do explain at the beginning of the game, hey, I want you to own some of this. So I may ask you, setting those expectations. When I ask you, just be ready to kind of describe your actions. I always tell every player, and I think this kind of sets the tone. In addition, most people say, oh, I'm playing a half elf ranger. And most people, when they start describing their character, they start going into backstory. I tell
Mm-hmm.
players up front, I don't necessarily want to hear your backstory. It's okay if you want to share it. I'm not saying you can't. But remember, if you're meeting this party, or even if you've been traveling with this party, you may not have shared all of that. I
Mm-hmm.
also remind players some of your favorite characters you've ever met in a story, you don't know their backstory till 5 or 6 episodes in.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me who you are when you walk into that tavern or when we meet you on the road. The first thing that they all need to do is describe how you look as close as you can to a T. Even if you share an image, describe that image. The white hair, the tall, thin. And I always ask them, how do you walk? How do you stand? Do you find yourself? And usually, once I get through that, it's a slower process.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get through it, you've now forced everybody to kind of do an icebreaker where they've kind of opened themselves up a little
Yeah.
bit, and then you don't run into it so much in the game. Now you do run those players who, like you said, they'll tell you they suddenly you ask them what they're doing in combat, and now they're beheading and they're doing it in slow motion, and then the blood is dripping, and everybody's sitting there. And I usually have a conversation with those players if I have to, and I
Mm-hmm.
remind those players who really like to steal the show. Next time you rant like that, how can you draw another player into it or pass it off? Make sure that your descriptions include everyone else, and you
Mm-hmm.
pass it off to someone else, especially a new player. When you're doing something, look at a new player and ask them when you're introducing your character. I like when players introduce their characters by talking with another player and asking them or saying something about them. Like, I really like, where did you get that crossbow? The ornamentation on it is so nice. Whatever it is, that stuff all kind of starts to create that mindset of everyone is sharing the story, and I'm not the only storyteller at the table.
Interesting. That's a
Yeah.
really good advice. Thank you for that. I'm gonna
Yeah.
use that.
Sorry, I'm long-winded.
No, no, that is exactly what I need. Uh, that's really a good point you have though, and I really like the idea you had just brief at the end. You mentioned the idea of getting a player to bring in another player into their long-winded explanation and make kind of that would definitely help build an adventure party, bring them a lot closer together, make it a team activity. I think that is an amazing
Yeah.
tip that I haven't seen before or read or heard, so I'm stealing that for my
Go
own
for it.
games because I like that.
Yeah, everybody thinks they're the star of the show, and I get it, you are. But you're that guy next to you. He's the star of his story. So make sure you're making everybody feel like the star,
Yeah,
and that's the goal.
I always like to look at adventure parties more like, of course, the classic The Lord of the Rings, where it's like it's an ensemble. Sure, we're looking a lot at
Yes.
Frodo and Sam, and then we look a lot at Aragorn,
Hmm.
but really we're looking at everyone, and they all have their moments,
Yes.
and that's why I love those movies. But
And actually it could come off what I just said is like that's not what I actually mean is naturally we all see ourselves as stars. So going back to the idea of a player, if a player helps another player
mhm,
and assist that player, then it's kind of like passing it off that
yeah,
ensemble. It creates more of a team environment than you constantly focus on what is my player doing all the time,
hmm, yeah, and then it lets
But
them
that's
focus
cool.
on
I
the other
like that idea.
players. That's no,
Yeah.
that's a good idea. That's really great. Um, Man, I was gonna have a follow up, but then you answered that question. So,
Well, I'm sorry.
no,
we got.
that's
Hey, I'm
great.
I'm I'm just talking with you.
I wanted to actually touch on another topic we mentioned beforehand was the idea of
Hmm.
using D&D for betterment or gamifying your life a little bit,
Yeah.
which you mentioned with corporate games and team building exercises. What has been your experience so far with those kind of games, with corporate games, I guess?
Yeah, and those are things that I am kind of there's more of an I wouldn't say I am a corporate DM. Those are things that I want to continue to do.
Mm-hmm.
My job has allowed me to work in a corporate setting where I'm allowed to try some of the things that I'm thinking about
Mm-hmm.
with people at the workplace. And so I often play with certain things in the workplace by trying to see what will happen. How can I create a team, foster a team environment if I take I'm in sales. So if I have the sales
Mhm.
guys and then the marketing guys or the marketing folks, we take three people from marketing, we take three people from sales, and we have them play D&D together, then that's a great team building, process for them. If I've done things where I've actually taken a manager and made them play a boss in a fight and, reinforce that, see how the players play off of those ideals. Having players think about, I've done a few corporate games outside of my workplace. Did a small one for Amazon as well as a company called Factual. And so they've just been really fun exercise, and they're really helping me grow, and they're helping me see that I've read a lot of articles about how this game is being used, everything from for people with disabilities or help to being taught now and used in school. I think all that's great, and I think the corporate place is just another step in that direction of showing people that if you look at a character sheet and don't even think about the character, think about who is Malcolm or who is Richard, and put yourself on a sheet. You can self-analyze yourself with gamification and numbers, and like, for example, and say where's my charisma? Could
Mhm.
I talk more in meetings? Could I? How am I perceived by my fellow? How, if I had to rate myself, what would that number look like? If I looked at my constitution, and not in a negative way, but if I
Right.
had to look at my constitution, how could I improve my health? Those
Mhm.
kind of things is how I see D&D being useful in the future in those areas.
Yeah. That
I
is
know
a
that's kind of like out there.
No, but that's I mean, we always people always talk about the therapeutic nature of D&D and D and how it can be very cathartic as people dive into, having conversations or doing things that they've always maybe wanted to do in real life or needed to do for their psychological well-being. And I think that just ties directly into that, like being able to look at yourself and the gamification is a big thing that's come out over the last couple of years is the idea of
Yeah.
turn your life and your task lists into a game where you can level up and do these things. I've tried them several times because I'm like, oh, I like games. If I make a to-do list that I get experience points for accomplishing, I'll do better. It doesn't work for me,
Right.
but
No.
but I know of a lot of people who do and are able to take that into accomplishing some great goals and setting goals that are very achievable for them. And I
Yeah.
think D&D can play into that too. Like you
Yeah,
know,
absolutely. And I think it's not the idea of trying to try to get them to follow this pattern of using D&D to gamify your
mm-hmm.
life, but more so of realizing that you've kind of gamified your life already through all of the different, there's
Mm-hmm.
multiple facets that we could probably look at and just say, here's just another one where you can look at D&D outside of it, take a step back and as an exercise, not one that you're
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
follow every day, but as an exercise, you can kind of like evaluate a character in you, who you are in real life, and then you take that next step. And then for corporate people who often aren't, that's easier for them to probably do, but then
Mm-hmm.
take that next step and say, okay, a lot of people I work with aren't using their imagination all the time, and then using your imagination to build a character, and then also showing you how your imagination is an important muscle that reinforces these other skills that we use every day. I use my imagination. My creativity, I think, plays into when I'm when I'm just doing my job on a daily basis, because it helps me think outside of the box sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's always the artsy side of our brains has kind of been reserved for, or it's kind of been looked down kind of upon. The arts aren't the big thing like they used to be. And I think they're just as important. They're so important to have that well-roundedness to your
Mm-hmm.
mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've
Yeah.
also seen that in my day job when I was working, it's the same. Creativity comes into play. Thinking outside the box is a very useful skill. Um,
Yeah.
that's a really good point you have on that, and looking at the way it's kind of like using looking at our life the same way we look at D&D in order to find
Right.
ways we can improve, ways we can change without going overboard, of course. That's
Of
yeah.
course.
um
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
That's when we go back to satanic panic, right?
Yeah, that gets a little too scary, a little too real. I wanted to shift, or I just wanted to point out a comment in the chat that makes perfect sense. He said it's also good for people to actually try out tools or ideas for writing and acting and arts. So you can,
Yeah.
D&D can be used for a lot of those, artistic things. And happy Cinco de Mayo, Jack, in the chat. Happy Cinco de Mayo, Malcolm.
Yeah, thank
I
you. Happy Cinco de Mayo to you as well. I totally forgot.
it's
Well, Cinco de
every
Mayo,
day
I
is
actually have
blending
my
together.
whiskey in here.
What was that?
I know it's like, oh, I said I have my whiskey sitting here,
Oh,
so so maybe I'll take a swig. I don't know if that feels
it's
appropriate for
fine.
the interview.
It's the internet show.
Um, right? It's
I wanted
um,
to touch on another. We you touched on so many things before we actually went live, and we were talking a little bit about now and having to play games online, and how
yeah,
you approached it a little differently than a lot of people have. A lot of people have dive into Roll20 and
hmm
Discord and using the Roll20 tools to maximum
yeah,
effectiveness, which in my experience, it's a lot more work running a game on Roll20 than running a game in real life, in
absolutely.
my opinion. Um, but what are your tips and tricks that you do for running games online right now?
Yeah, and just kind of based, I won't reiterate all the stuff, but the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that I talked about in terms of how I run a game is just how I think about the game that I'm going to run. So if I feel like a pivotal part of my game is going to be combat, and I know that there's going to be a moment in there in boss fight, I know that I also think about the players. If my players, I feel like the type of learners or the type of gamers they are, they're going to need to be able to see everything. Then I'm going to probably come with a game where I'm going to show them the map and I'm going to put things on the board. Uh, and if I think that it's a game, so maybe I'm playing with a group where they can vibe off of my cinematic style. Maybe I'll do less of that and I'll show more pictures. But I like Zoom. Zoom is my main thing because I can go to gallery mode and I get the faces. I can see you right now how I see you, like nice and big,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how I played in person. I kind of was able to feed off of the reactions that I was getting. I could see if a player was checking out and maybe I needed to re-engage. And so I need that. And often those certain softwares where the screens are really small, it's harder for me to do that and look at my notes and focus. I want to focus on the players.
Mm-hmm.
I also don't want my players to get so focused on just staring at a tabletop. I don't want us to get lost in the crunching of the numbers and me constantly looking up a rule. And
Mm-hmm.
while those fantasy grounds and Roll20, they do great at facilitating for that type of DM. They don't. It's not my cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
It slows me down and slows my game down. And I found that I really did my due diligence. I was like, I'm not going to be a grumpy old man about this. I'm going to learn it. And I learned it and I used it. And I used it in several games. And I have other DMs who I play with who use Roll20 specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But after playing a few games and going, okay, I know what I can use out of here. It's like it's a toolbox, and I
Yeah.
use certain tools. I use maps. I might use to share pictures,
Mm-hmm.
but I stay away from the combat being on a virtual tabletop, because I feel like it slows the game down and it forces us to start to look at combat like a board game. And while I love board games, that's not what I'm trying to achieve when I play D&D.
Mm-hmm.
I tell people if they want a board game, we could play Warhammer all day. I've got some great games that simulate skirmish battles, and I think those battles have their place in D&D. But even while you're having a really good skirmish battle in D&D, it helps to be able, like, and when you're a DM, you're kind of like a magician, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
when you're playing at a tabletop, you've got the miniatures on the board, but you can do things with your hands. You can have the players look at each other and you can keep them from just staring
Yeah.
at the board. And so that's what I try to stay away from, it just being like, okay, so whose turn is it? All right. And then everyone's like, oh, well, no, don't use that because we only got one potion left, and everybody's like metagaming around the
Yeah.
combat, and I want to feel more free flowing. And so Zoom has allowed me to do that, and my phone logging in as a second camera to put something on the board,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it, and some and D&D Beyond. I love D&D Beyond,
Oh yeah.
at least for creating campaigns quickly, getting everybody in there, setting up encounters. It's great.
And now
So
they
that's what I
just
use.
released their dice roller tool. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, which I'm going to be. I have not
I
seen it
just
yet.
got the email. I saw it on social media. I'm like, after this interview, I'm going to go click
Yeah,
around and see what that's about, because
yeah,
that's awesome. That's very useful. I'm
that's
terrible
awesome.
at
Yeah.
math, so any tool that helps me do that better is great.
That's true. I'm the same way,
But I
and
do
I'm like
like
not saying
physical
that's
dice.
you.
Nothing against physical dice. It's just my math
I
isn't
do
great.
too.
That's
Yeah,
what I get
yeah,
for not paying attention in school.
Yeah, I like
enough.
physical dice, and that does slow me down often when I'm rolling. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, give me a second, you know?
Yeah, you're like I rolled a 10 plus a 4 plus a 3 and then you're half an hour later I'm still counting and the number's only 15 or something like that.
I feel
That
you on that.
yeah. But the game is so good that you have to play it anyways. Um,
Yeah.
and all that stuff you were just saying about the table, that also applies back to when we were talking about, getting your players engaged by asking them their physical actions and having them do it descriptively. That just ties it all together in a neat little package. You have a very unique challenge, though, that you kind of created for yourself in your public games, where, well, I
Hmm.
don't know for sure how many. Well, I'll start with that. How many of players actually show up like every session you have, or do you have a kind of rotating pool of characters that come in?
It's kind of a rotating pool. And so, for example, I'm running games every Saturday. I run about 2 games a week, sometimes three.
Mm-hmm.
Game on Wednesday, game on Saturday, sometimes a game on Sunday evening. The games on Saturday started as one shots, and then they slowly turned into a campaign, and then that campaign slowly turned into the party splitting. So now
Mm-hmm.
every other week is the off party. So there's about I would say there's about 5 to 7 players on every game on each one of those Saturdays. About four of each of those seven are consistent like characters,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's usually a revolving slot for. There's usually like a couple I call like supporting cast where anybody can jump in to the campaign and play for a while, or even if they want stay on for as long as they can. And I just kind of try to manage it. I have a thing by Wednesday or Thursday of every week. If the main characters have not RSVP'd for a game, I open up more slots for more people who want to jump into the campaign
Mm-hmm. Okay.
and make it work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that definitely ties into my perspective of this
Yeah.
challenge you made, which is you have kind of a rotating cast of characters, and I've seen kind of the response on social media to your games. People seem to, enjoy, and I look at the pictures, and everyone's having a good time. How do you get people so engaged when they may only be there for one session, and how do you keep yourself from going crazy by coming up with that many story hooks?
It's interesting. It would be tough if my brain already didn't work like that. If I try to turn it off, I'm sure you know how
Mm-hmm.
that feels. Where you try to and then you find yourself thinking about it. You're like, I'm not gonna think about D&D today, and then like
No,
somewhere halfway through the day, you're like,
never
how do
works.
I work this? Somebody signs up, and how do I work them into this week's
Mm-hmm.
story when they're in the middle of a fight?
Yeah.
And so it's almost like a challenge. It's like, how can I find the most crazy way I can make all of this work? I think that's the question you're asking. Like, how do you like facilitate,
Yeah.
the constant idea that the story could be, you're constantly bringing people in, constantly bringing people out, and then
Yeah.
always trying to keep them engaged. I also would say that my goal for even a player that might not be at the table that long, I try to make sure every episode has a big moment. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
You're not always going to get it, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't always try to force it. But if I can have a big moment, and even and when I say cliffhangers, I don't say it's always like they're always gonna almost gonna die, or it's literally a cliffhanger where they're it's like life or death, because that gets boring.
Mm-hmm.
I just try to make every episode end on some kind of note where it hopefully, if two or three of the players at the table were like, oh my gosh, I need to hopefully come back and get in the story and find out why that is, then I kind of done my job, because
Mm-hmm.
that's the culture we live in. Look at Netflix. It's like we live in this Netflix culture where story episodes need to have a cliffhanger or people check out.
Yeah.
There's so many different things to engage with, from my phone to my tablet to all these different things and different mediums. So you want to have something in there that even that one player is going to play just for that one Saturday will say, man, I can't play next week, but I can't wait to get in 2 or 3 weeks
Mm-hmm.
and find out what's going on with this story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's funny that you call it an episode because we a lot of times we'll stop ourselves, right? We'll be in a conversation like, oh, on the next episode, oh, I mean session, but really when we really think
Yep.
about it, it's like every session is a little movie and it is an episode, and I think that's a
I
nice
specifically call my episodes, I literally call them episodes on
episodes.
purpose.
Yeah,
I start every episode with I call a cold open. A lot of times I don't
nice.
always, but a cold
Yeah,
open for like, based on television,
yeah.
I'm sure So doing that, and usually usually there's a musical song tied to my opening and my all the way down to my credit. Even though there's no credits, I call credits the moment post game where we're all just sitting around talking.
Mm-hmm.
And the minute I usually end with fade to black or crash to black. That's how our games always end. So, so if I crash to black, you better believe I've got a song ready to go that I feel
Uh,
like just is just going to play in the background. Not going to have anything to do with the story, but hopefully it
right.
usually ties in some way. It has some reason to be there. And so even while they're talking, I'll have a player go, "Oh, you chose that song because of, oh yeah, I did," or "Oh man, that just made me think about that was the," and then when that happens, I'm like, "Yes, that was the purpose." And that can go wrong. That can be distracting, but I've gotten accustomed to it, and people who sit at my table know that if you don't like that style, you're not gonna like my game,
Mm-hmm.
and it's okay with me. And I actually understand why people don't like music and different stuff like that, but that's just it motivates me since I don't get to play the game. I'm facilitating it.
Yeah.
That's kind of part of how I build it. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that idea. That's another one I'm going to steal. I was thinking about that because I do the same. You got to end on a cliffhanger or some kind of moment where I always wait until I got my players like talking amongst themselves, like speculating on what's next, and then I'll hit them with one
Yeah.
last twist, and then I'm like, and that's the game. But I
That's the
like the
game.
idea of
Yeah,
music.
they love it.
I like that music. Like if I was like, that's the game, boom, hit the music, and then it's like so
Yeah.
the Highlander theme or something. That would be
Yeah.
amazing.
And even if I can't get them to, even if I can't bring a cliffhanger to the story, maybe they're just
Mhm.
ending and they're just having a good night rest.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's great. I always just like to ask the players the way I end the story. If I don't have a cliffhanger, we're not in battle. I'll say, where's everybody? Where's every character at in their headspace? I'd like to everyone to go around and just share,
Uh huh.
how they're feeling right now, whether they're sharing with the party or maybe we're just getting a glimpse inside the character's head. Because players often get into this thing where like the stoic character who never shares their
Yeah.
background because it's supposed to come out secret, so they're just always sitting in the corner quiet. I like to ask those questions, tell those players like it's okay to share what you're thinking, even if you're not saying it, because now you're building a character. Even though it's like Cloud in Final Fantasy,
Yeah.
he doesn't say anything, but that's because we get to learn about him through as a passenger, viewing it and playing him, and then we're also interjecting ourselves in him.
Mm-hmm.
It's how we built that character. But players characters don't realize that those stereotype characters can get boring if you don't, if you don't let us know
Yeah.
a little bit about yourself, even still.
Yeah. It's
I
the
don't
same
know.
as like The Witcher. Have you watched The Witcher on Netflix?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
So it's like here's Geralt is the most stoic, cold character, but every so often you just get that little glimpse of what's going
you
on
get
in
a
his
little glimpse.
head. But then you see the hero, he can't turn his back when people need his help, even though he's like cold and he's like, I won't do it. But it's like,
Absolutely.
oh, he's gonna do it. And
Yep.
that's what made him such a memorable character, I think. And that's a great tip to get players to create those characters that are just as memorable, even if they're the quiet, dark, brooding backstory
Yeah.
characters. That's a good idea. Now I have a very difficult question for you. I want to know
Okay.
what is the one thing you struggle with the most as a game master?
That is a good one. Um, that is one that I struggle. Um, I think a lot with. You actually got me. It was funny. It's actually one that I actually thought about, but I think there's a few different things.
Okay.
I struggle with trying to. Sometimes I struggle with my idea of just kind of drawing back. Sometimes of all these things I talk about that I'm trying to do. Sometimes just letting it breathe and letting like my whole goal is always to let the players have the story, but I think sometimes our goal is to move the story along, and we kind of can sometimes push the players.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'll catch myself and I'll be like, "Oh, I'm pushing the story along, but I don't think they're ready. Let me stop and let them just have this." Even though we've been having a conversation for an hour in the tavern, they're enjoying that.
Mm-hmm.
As a DM, you're often like, "Can we get to a story beat?" But I do struggle with that sometimes of going like struggle with like deciding when is too long. Like when is that conversation? When is like this? When should I like literally lean on them, push them to the next stage of
Mm-hmm.
the story while giving them options, or how long, or when do I just kind of sit back and wait for them to say, hey, what should we do next? So I think that can be challenging, at times. So that's definitely something.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I struggle with that one myself too, because that is hard to read. Like when the players are having a good time, and you're like, should we move on? I don't know. And then if you wait too long, then they get bored. And yeah, so that's an
It's
interesting
definitely
one.
a challenge online too, because now that
Oh
we're
yeah.
online, it's harder to you're like, to keep that pacing, going at a proper, level. Yeah.
So what do you do
Um,
to help yourself, you know, overcome
yeah.
that challenge in your games?
Uh, Constantly keep checking in with players throughout the those moments, and then checking in to see if they are enjoying the moment, or if they're, because sometimes they're having a they're pausing because they're actually waiting for me to do something or to kind of tell them to.
Mm-hmm.
And so checking in and offering those, reminding them of the hooks, or having them reminding them of things that the different things that are out there if they don't know what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think that helps. And just like, yeah, just kind of staying engaged with everyone. If I don't hear from someone too long, I'll, immediately reminding myself, hey, to that character, what do you think about, maybe there's two players that are having this back and forth. You just have those two gamers who are trying to figure out what to do next, and they kind of become the face of the party making the decision. I always like to try to check in with those other players, the quiet players, and say, what do you think about this? What would you do in the situation? Even if you're not sharing it, how would you tackle this scenario? And then force
Yeah.
that player to, and then usually it's that quiet player who all along is like, this is why we should just go.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's like, yeah, you're right. Like I said, that's the difficulty, is trying not to feel like I am making them go,
Mm-hmm.
but making them take the agency and go, okay, now let's go.
Yeah.
Let's make a choice and let's do it. Let's stand behind it and do it.
Yeah.
So, and I
That's a
think it's
good
a challenge
idea.
in a lot of games.
Yeah, it is. I think that's one that a
Uh,
lot of people struggle with. And
yeah,
I always like to ask people that question, like, what do they struggle with and how do they overcome that? Because then that gives
yeah,
a kind of a, what is it, a critical thinking mindset a little bit that other people can
yeah,
watch and be like, oh, I struggle with that too. That's how they get over it. Maybe
yeah.
I can try that, or maybe they can start thinking that same way themselves. But now I want to know, what is your number one tip for brand new game masters?
That's a good one. Um, I think the number one tip is do not, same approach that I tell players who are new, is to not get overwhelmed by the rules. I think when I said earlier about 5e, or why I loved 5e, is that the first rule was that the rules are subjective, and to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you get what I'm saying, but like, it was built for you to build the game on a foundation you want. And so all you need to do is just start, like when I started, sit down with a friend and let me try this. And all I thought about was, okay, I get the concept of the D20, I get the concept of the stats, get a few things and go with the base level of what you need for a game.
Mm-hmm.
Don't try to overwhelm yourself, which I often do when I
Mm-hmm.
get a new system with the lore. That's also probably another challenge that kind of goes back to the challenge of being a DM. That's probably even a better one, is that I have a challenge of trying to absorb too much and
Mm-hmm.
trying to have it all ready to go. And just, when I go back to when I started, it's just like, you know what, hey man, just, you don't know something, you don't know it. If I don't know a spell, I don't know it. And the beauty of the game is, if you don't know it, make it up on the spot, make a ruling, tell the players you don't know. Oh, I don't know how that works, but you know what? I don't want to slow the game down, so I'm not looking it up. Here's the way it works for today, and I guarantee you, next time when we play again, I'll make sure the rule works right for
Yeah,
everyone.
that it's
That's how I learned, because I don't know all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't. And even the stuff I do end up knowing, there's only so much capacity before I have to dump some of it
Yeah,
to bring in some new.
yeah.
So
We can't all be
that would be it. Just
encyclopedias.
play the game.
Yeah. That's really good
Yeah,
advice that, like, I think it bears repeating multiple times. It's like, make a ruling in the moment, go back later, check on the rule, figure it out, and be
yeah,
comfortable with admitting when you're wrong, or with, if you don't know something, it's fine. Everyone
yeah,
does it. Everyone does it.
yeah.
Uh,
My other thing I would tell people is
mhm,
just to um, like, try to get out of your comfort zone, because the best DM is kind of like acting or anything. Make stupid face expressions,
mhm,
have fun with yourself, and then be ready to do that at the table. And the more you can break that, the more people are going to enjoy sitting at the table. The more expressive you can be, because you don't want to be a processing unit. People aren't playing a PC game where you just need to have all the rules. I think DMs get bogged down by, I need to know all this stuff to run the
mhm.
game, where you need to get people just to engage with you, so that you can, with them, tell a good story.
Yeah.
and that's the hardest thing to do, but it just takes practice.
Yeah. Do you do character
Yeah.
voices?
I do not. I mean, I'm looking at
Okay.
NPC voices, guys like that, man. I am trying to get myself to do more. All my accents are just terrible. They're all like generic. They all just
Hmm.
mix. I'll start one, I'll try to go Scottish, and it turns Russian. It just sounds awful, and I just try to like toss it up to like, hey, we're in a fantasy world.
Yeah.
All these accents
It
wouldn't
is what it
necessarily
is.
be what they are anyway.
Yeah.
But I try to I had a player literally tell me one time. He's like, that's what made me start practicing more. He was like, you got like three ranges. He's like, you've got like the nice voice, the mean, and you've got like your villain voice. And I was like, oh, okay, I got to start working on this. And it's kind of true. My
Hmm.
villains are kind of similar. I try to, and so I'm forcing myself. Even if I can't do an accent, how can I make them sound differently? Their speech patterns, how they speak, and do they talk really fast, or do they are they super stoic and quiet, and are they
Hmm.
super deep? Are they? So I am playing with it, but I am by no means there. But I am not. I try to have fun with it in the moment for sure.
That's really good advice. Looking at it that way. I have two voices. I do bad Christopher Walken and then angry sailor, and all my NPCs sound like one of those two voices. And I save the bad Christopher Walken for like the really special NPCs.
Okay.
So
Yeah, that I
everyone's
was
an
gonna
angry
say that is
sailor.
a special.
Yeah, the really special
Angry Sailors
ones.
and Christopher Walken.
Yeah,
Those sound like great NPCs to encounter for
but
sure.
then like the
Have you
princess
seen
is
Joe
that.
Manganiello's Christopher Squawkins
No, I
NPC?
haven't. I haven't heard that one. Oh, now I'm
He
gonna
does a
have to do
Christopher
that.
Walken, but he's a seagull. One of his characters has a patron that's like a seagull, I believe. It's called, or yes, it's not a bird. It's
Okay.
called Christopher Squawken.
I'll have to
That
look
was
that
funny.
one up. That sounds fabulous. We have one
It is
question from the audience we're going to jump into. And this ties
okay.
back to what we were talking about earlier. He posted this earlier. This is from Jack Grimble. He says, do you think
Okay.
it's a good to do a recap at the start of the session or to let the players do it?
Ooh, that's a good one. I play with both of them. I try to. I kind of usually probably honestly based on how I'm feeling. Do I feel like talking a lot? So there's a lot of talking that you have to do at the DM as a DM at the beginning of the game.
Mm-hmm.
You got to like set the rules. You got to set all these precedents. Then you got to open the story. So then you're doing more talking by recapping. So sometimes it is nice to just say, "Hey, what happened? Let's like somebody share." And I'll usually offer up some experience points for who wants to volunteer to do that, and have them recap it. And I didn't come up with, but I've read this in other places that it's also a good practice to allow you to see if the players know what you think that what did they actually retain.
Yeah.
Like there's moments where like players are telling, and I'm like, no, that's not what happened. No, that's not what happened at all. And that does happen sometimes. But
Mm-hmm.
it allows are they retaining what you're sharing? And so then you can maybe come in and say that was great, appreciate you. Yeah, here's a couple of extra little things that were missing from that I'll just kind of let everybody know real quick if you want to take notes, and then you're done.
Yeah.
I also started doing recently for the campaigns, having somebody take notes is
Mm-hmm.
great. Sometimes that person is willing to either share those notes for what happened. But I always it's a little bit of both, I guess. For me, it's like let them share, and then I'll put in a few nuggets there to kind of make it more dramatic, and then kick
Yeah.
the story off.
And then fill in
So,
the
but I
gaps.
don't think it's a bad thing to have them do it for
No,
sure.
I found since I started having my players do the recaps, I find it much less stressful starting the game because as a DM, I get in my head where I'm like, oh, I'm
Yes,
doing the recap, and then I have to tie the recap perfectly into the start of this
yes,
session, and then I'm like, oh, and it doesn't flow well sometimes, and then it comes off a little clunky. But then when they do it, I'm like, yeah, and then and then they usually my players have gotten pretty good at ending right where we ended, and then I'm like, and then here, and we can start the session right away. Um,
yeah,
so yeah, Jack, I definitely say it's really good to have your players do it, and then just add in a little bit, and then they get more invested, I think too, thinking like, oh, we have to do the recap. Once they get used to that,
yes,
then they pay more attention, so they can do the recaps.
yes. That's
It's
true, and I've actually noticed a change on that where people know more what's going on now that I've forced them to do more
yeah.
of the recapping for sure.
Yeah, you share
Oh,
that
that's
responsibility,
actually really good.
and then
I
they
like
they
that.
step up
Yeah,
and they take on some of that responsibility themselves. I like the idea of the
definitely.
notes. I haven't done that myself. I haven't asked players specifically to take notes, so maybe that's next week. We'll find out. Uh, with that, Malcolm, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a really
Thank
informative,
you.
excellent conversation. I want to know, just last thing before we close out, where can people find you online and what can they expect to see?
Yeah, please check me out at my main source is gentleman_game master on Instagram. You can also find me at the same handle on Facebook, as well as if you want to play a game with me on Meetup. I have a group called the D&D Experience Point, and I'm the gentleman game master there as well. So that's where you can kind of look at what games we have going on. There's a couple other DMs with me. I'm kind of like the main DM because of most of the games I'm running, and you can kind of find a game that if you want to jump in and play. If you're going on Instagram, that's a great way to see if you'll like my style. You'll see like the type of miniatures I use and the setup pieces I use, and you can hear some of the music I use and see recaps and just all the stuff that I'm sharing. It'll give you a good idea. Be like, hey, do I want to sit at a table with this guy for 4 hours or stare at my screen, with this guy for 4 hours? Sure, or
Mm-hmm.
nah, and that's perfect. But if you have any questions, you guys can reach out to me at all those places.
Yeah, and those will all be linked in the description of this video. Once the stream is over, it'll be live automatically. So make sure you guys check them out over
Awesome.
there. If you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, please do so. We have more
Yeah.
videos just like this tomorrow. Who do we have tomorrow? Tomorrow's actually an early episode. We're starting 2 hours early because the guest is from the
Ooh,
Netherlands. His name is Tim DeRoos. He goes by Bonus Action on Instagram. Great
yeah,
homebrew content creator. So be here tomorrow for that. Yeah,
I will.
again, Malcolm, thank you so much for joining me today. I really do appreciate all the advice you gave me. I feel like this was just me getting advice from you today. So excellent stuff.
No, thank you, Rich.
Uh,
I appreciate you.
and
Thanks for
with
having me.
that, we will see y'all tomorrow.